we have returned. Here are the next Nightmare matchups for the champions on the second half, a little bit past the second half, of 2023 heading into the first half of 2024. Every single champion has a degree of a Nightmare matchup, the most difficult fight for them in the weight class. And we're going to go through all of those champions, picking their number one most difficult fight in the weight class, and I'm also going to go through 3 of the runner-ups. We're going to start with the lightest weight class. The first champion on the list, the much well-rounded, dominant appearing, evolving to look like the most perfect fighter in women's MMA, Zhang Weili, who has excellent striking skills all throughout, dynamic and powerful, while also bringing together a newfound wrestling game combined with excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills. It's looking very hard for any fighter to defeat Zhang Weili, especially holding a well-rounded skill set, as she has defeated many of these fighters already, which leads to a specialist gonna give her the hardest time, and her nightmare matchup is going to be Tatiana Suarez. Tatiana Suarez is purely the best wrestler in the whole weight class, one of the best wrestlers in all of women's MMA, does not excel in the stand-up, but has an area where she can exploit a part of Zhang Weili's skill set, and that is the wrestling. This is the only fighter in the weight class that can impose a threatening grappling game up against her. Whereas Zhang Weili is usually the superior fighter everywhere the fight goes, this is going to be the one matchup where there's a clear difference in wrestling skill. And Tatiana Suarez is relentless with her takedowns, even garnered the nickname the female Habib, with also crushing submission ability, has impeccable strength combined with her technique, and shows better and better cardio, where in the past that seemed to be a bit of a concern for a lot of fans in Tatiana's future. And because of that, I'm gonna have to rate Zhang Weili's level of danger as a 5 out of 10. After Tatiana Suarez, the level of danger drops precipitously. So the next runner-up, I believe, is another well-rounded fighter, and that is Yan Xiaonan. Yan Xiaonan is decent at everything, a jack of all trades, and will not get beat as easily as some of the other contenders in the weight class. The second runner-up is a familiar opponent who just fought Zhang Weili, Amanda Lemos. Amanda Lemos always has the kind of power to threaten somewhat on the stand-up, and also has a sneaky submission game, so she should not be able to get beat as easily as some of the other contenders. She's not dominant, but she is dangerous. And the third runner-up, I believe, is Mackenzie Dern. Mackenzie Dern is another specialist in the weight class, but the difficulty with her compared to someone like Tatiana is that she doesn't have a way to get the fight to the ground. She can't even use her Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialty unless she's able to develop a good wrestling game, and Zhang Weili is clearly the much better wrestler than Mackenzie Dern, but Mackenzie does have good power in her hands. She's very scrappy and wild. She can throw some things out there that can make it difficult for Zhang Weili at times, but ultimately not going to be too much of a threat for the champion. And then we go to the flyweight weight class with a new and unexpected champion, Alexa Grasso, the only Mexican champion right now. She's more of a jiu-jitsu boxer, has very good hands, a quick trigger for submissions as seen when she dethroned the longtime champ Valentina Shevchenko, and that is ultimately going to be her number one nightmare matchup. The same exact opponent, Valentina Shevchenko, is the nightmare matchup for Alexa Grasso. When we look at that fight again, Valentina was succeeding in her wrestling, which she found later in the fight. In the beginning, she was getting outboxed and losing the striking exchanges because of that. But going into a rematch, there is that new approach that she found in the middle of her fight with Alexa Grasso that she can start the next fight with. Use her wrestling, use her well-rounded skill set, do not expose herself too much, and she also does have a good striking style, especially with the kicks, to keep her opponent at bay from getting inside with her hands, and that can change levels under those punches, hold position, and land with some good ground and pound and stuff like that. Valentina has a lot of experience, she's very well-rounded, so Valentina Shevchenko's level of danger to Alexa Grasso, I believe, is a 7 out of 10. The first runner-up is Erin Blanchfield. Erin Blanchfield just defeated Taila Santos, and she has one of the most threatening grappling styles in the whole weight class for anybody. She's relentless with her pressure, she's not a great striker at all, she should get outstruck by Alexa Grasso, but Grasso may not be ready for the strength as well as the grappling technique overall. She's extremely dangerous on the ground and very, very tough, shown with the amount of shots she took from Taila Santos and still able to deliver with a lot of pressure, with a lot of activity. The second runner-up, I believe, is Manon Fiorot. Manon Fiorot is enormous for the weight class. She is so physically strong, very, very powerful, an imposing opponent that can be pretty difficult for Alexa Grasso to exchange with. Her clinch is also very difficult to get out of. The third runner-up, I believe, is Taila Santos. who is not too far off from the other two runner-ups. She is very well-rounded, physically strong, dynamic boxing, but it's not the most technical. She can get the fight to the ground, she can strike very well with most of the fighters in this weight class. She should be a very even, but yet difficult matchup for Alexa Grasso. And then we skip the bantamweight division because there is no champion, and we're gonna go right into the men's flyweight division, where there is another new champion, Alexandre Pantoja. Pantoja's a back-taking wizard with a gritty, brawling style in the stand-up, relying on his chin a little too much, who doesn't have the greatest technique but is able to get by due to his power and the ability to get the fight to the ground and take the opponent's back. There's a few amount of fighters in this weight class that can grapple with Pantoja, and he's so incredibly durable, it's very difficult to finish him. But I believe his nightmare matchup is a fighter who has already beaten him and has a good opposing style, Deiveson Figueiredo. Deiveson Figueiredo has already beaten Pantoja in a very difficult fight, but back in that day, Figueiredo was lacking in the cardio department. He had no 5-round fights and barely even went 3 rounds by the time he fought Pantoja. After that, he acquired so much experience, specifically going 5 rounds at a fast pace with Brandon Moreno multiple times. His cardio has increased leaps and bounds to the point where in a rematch with Pantoja, he should be able to last fairly well. And with a fighter who relies so much on his chin, the worst opponent to fight is someone who packs the amount of power that Figueiredo does, who is faster, has a longer reach, has more power, striking technique is on his side, has also a very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game. Deiveson Figueiredo is the most difficult fight for Alexandre Pantoja. The only thing going against Figueiredo is the fact that he is older and he's taken a lot of damage. I believe him and Moreno have not come out of those fights the same. So I ultimately do think that Figueiredo's level of danger to Pantoja is also a 7 out of 10. And the first runner-up is a familiar opponent, Brandon Moreno. Brandon Moreno had a tight contest with Pantoja in the second fight. He has incredible boxing, a very quick jab, a leveled Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game that can compete somewhat with Pantoja, and has the cardio and experience to make it a very difficult fight a third time. The second runner-up, I believe, is Kai Kara-France. Kai has insane amount of power in his hands. He has developed a solid takedown defense game where that was lacking before. He has patient precision with his hands, being another fighter in the weight class that could hurt Pantoja if he connects him with the right kind of shot. And the third runner-up, I believe, is Amir Albazi. Albazi is the kind of fighter that can negate all of the takedowns. He is very strong and has a good wrestling base, while also having impressive power in his hands and being the better technical striker compared to Pantoja. Amir Albazi and Kai Kara-France are around the same kind of threat level to Pantoja style, and they're not far off from Brandon Moreno. So there are a lot of good matchups for Pantoja in that weight class. And then we go to one of the more talked about divisions in the UFC right now, the bantamweight division, and we just saw the new champion bringing sugar to the show, Sean O'Malley, a very unexpected champion, but a talented one nonetheless. Sean O'Malley is one of the more dynamic strikers in the UFC. He is one of the best examples of a sniper with a difficult reach to handle, combined with blinding speed to his striking style and an ever-evolving takedown defense game with improving checks on leg kicks. Sean O'Malley may not be one of the more well-rounded fighters out of all these champions, but he is one of the more dynamic champions that can finish the opponent at any given moment, reminding me a lot of something generally similar to an Anderson Silva. And to the general public, he does have a lot of dangerous matchups. And I believe the number one nightmare matchup, who is going to be actually very close, almost even with some of the runner-ups, Corey Sandhagen. I believe Corey Sandhagen is the most difficult matchup for Sean O'Malley. Sandhagen has become very well-rounded. He has added a lot of wrestling to his previously known, also dynamic striking style. The new wrinkle allowing him to chain up striking with wrestling makes him a difficult opponent for anybody in this weight class, especially against someone like Sean O'Malley for a few other reasons. Corey Sandhagen is also the only other fighter in the top 5 who is the same height and has the same reach as Sean O'Malley, and we know O'Malley works a lot on those two attributes. Going up against a guy who has the same dimensions, now things naturally become more difficult for O'Malley. Not only that, Corey has one of the best chins, very hard to hurt, and if you are able to drop him, like Petr Yan has, like John Lineker has, he's right back into the fight instantly. He is one of the more difficult fighters in this weight class to finish with strikes. Not only that, he has a credible, well-rounded, and technical striking game with some of the best setups out of any fighter in this weight class, able to fight well in both stances, and is able to string up combinations, making him a very special fighter. So I ultimately do think that Corey Sandhagen, with all of this bundled together, makes him the most difficult style for Sean O'Malley. And the level of danger I give him is a 7 out of 10. The first runner-up, which is not too far from the level of danger from Corey, is Merab Dvalishvili. Merab Dvalishvili has the most imposing wrestling game in the weight class. Relentless pressure, attempts takedowns more than anybody else, quite physically strong but more relentless with his technique, and a lot of people do think that Merab is somewhat of O'Malley's kryptonite. The reason why I do pick Corey over Merab is for the fact that Merab's striking is a lot uglier, and he does expose himself not too different from Aljamain, and he is shorter than Aljo, making him have to cross those distances to get at O'Malley a lot slower than Aljo had and Corey Sandhagen, but he is very threatening to the champion. The second runner-up, which is also quite even with Merab in my opinion, is Umar Nurmagomedov. Umar is very physically strong, has a much better striking game compared to Merab, is taller and longer as well, throws very good kicks. The leg kicks can be a bit of an issue combined with the wrestling and the explosive hands he's able to blitz you with. And those explosive hands transition into quick takedowns, potentially becoming the only fighter so far for the champion that has that Dagestani wrestling style, fence against them, and he is so incredibly quick to get your back and choke you out. Umar Nurmagomedov, right now as he is, I believe is a second runner-up, but he can potentially be higher. We just gotta see more from him. And then the third runner-up, it was a bit of a toss-up with Aljamain Sterling, but I ultimately am going to go with Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo is very, very short. He has the longest distance to do something effective against O'Malley, but he is one of the more careful fighters in doing so. Not only that, he may be the only fighter faster than O'Malley, while also having technically the best wrestling game, while also holding incredible and crushing power. And from there we go to the featherweight division, throning the most dominant champion currently in the UFC, Alexander Volkanovski, who's essentially, in a lot of people's opinion, the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He has great boxing. Some of the best leg kicks in the sport, a much improved and dangerous wrestling game, combined with some of the better ground and pound, great submission defense, and so big and strong for this weight class. He even said himself, he cuts more weight than anybody else. It seems impossible at this time for anybody to beat Alexander Volkanovski, but there has to be some opponent that has the most danger level, and I believe that is Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria has insane amount of power in his hands, an incredible amount of skill in his boxing, while coming from a background of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a black belt, while also implementing great wrestling as well. He's one of the few fighters that Volk has fought that can mix up boxing and wrestling against him. And if he gets the fight to the ground, he is a very lethal submission artist, crushing the opponent with his own powerful ground and pound as well, as you saw in the Ryan Hall fight. And we do know that Islam Makhachev has talked about Volk's shorter stature making it difficult for him to get under him for takedowns. Topuria is not going to have that kind of trouble. Topuria is practically the same height as Volkanovski. They have a very similar build, so Topuria should be able to get under Volkanovski for a takedown without as much difficulty because of how short he is. He's not as technical as Islam when it comes to that, but he's not going to run into that one issue. And when you talk about pressure, power, and boxing proficiency, Ilia Topuria brings a very dangerous skill set to Volkanovski, but that's not the most dangerous thing about Ilia. The most dangerous thing about him and his quick evolution, also being the fighter that has studied and game planned against Volk before Volk probably even knew who Ilia was. This is something similar you saw with fighters like Dominic Reyes going up against Jon Jones, or Chris Weidman going up against Anderson Silva, Johnny Hendricks going up against GSP, Cody Garbrandt going up against Dominic Cruz, Max Holloway going up against Jose Aldo. When you have these younger fighters who came into the UFC already knowing who the champion is, there's a mental advantage they could potentially have going into it, while also progressing at such a fast rate. It's going to be harder for the champion to get ready for that fast progression, because every time we see Ilia Topuria, he looks much, much better. And he does different things too. What he did against Josh Emmett was very different than what he did against his other opponents. And what he's going to do against Volk is potentially going to be very different than what he did against his other opponents as well, showing that quick evolution to his game. That is ultimately going to be the biggest danger to the long-reigning champion. I ultimately think the level of danger from Ilia Topuria is a 5 out of 10, which is not that large. The first runner-up, which is not too far off from Topuria, the first runner-up is Max Holloway. Max is an elite fighter in this weight class. He's been at the top for such a long time. He has so much experience, very good cardio, one of the best chins we've ever seen. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword, but he does have experience going up against Volk. So there are things he understands about Volk probably than most other fighters do. But on the other edge of that sword, Volk has this guy figured out, and that is a reason why I am not picking Max as the #1 nightmare matchup, is because Volk already figured this guy out with 3 fights against him. And Max is not really evolving anymore. He's pretty much looking like the same guy every time. He's just so much better than everybody else. It doesn't even matter. The number 2 runner-up is Arnold Allen, who I believe is physically one of the only fighters in this weight class that can contest with Volk in a test of strength. He's also well-rounded, has a very good gas tank, and having one of the best footwork in the weight class. And then the number 3 runner-up is Yair Rodriguez, who just lost to the champion. And it just goes to show you that there's not too many other guys that can threaten Volk, even to the level that Yair can. Yair always has a potential of danger when it comes to his kicking dexterity and techniques. He's also very tough, scrappy, and unpredictable, can make anything happen. And then we go to the most talked about weight class in the UFC, the most star-driven division, lightweight, whose king, who a lot of people think is going to replicate a lot of what Khabib did and become a dominant force in the weight class. That is Islam Makhachev. Islam is one of the best grapplers in the sport, who has a very unpredictable and seamless, effective striking skill, while also holding very high fight IQ, as well as some of these other champions like Volkanovski, like Zhang Weili, Jon Jones. Islam Makhachev is a very good example of what a champion's intellect should look like. And I'm gonna be honest, there are not a lot of very dangerous matchups for Islam, but I do believe the number 1 nightmare matchup is a familiar opponent. The star from Brazil, Charles Oliveira. Oliveira is so far the only fighter that was able to even up the grappling with Islam Makhachev before he got rocked and wasn't able to do so because he was concussed. When it comes to pure grappling skill, Oliveira is the only fighter that has shown to be able to even it with Islam. And on paper, he should be the better striker, not only having more power, better fundamental offensive technique, where I think Islam has better defensive technique, has the pressure style to stalk Islam from the outside to line up some of his sniping shots, while that approach also makes it more difficult for Islam to shoot takedowns, but it can make it easier for him to clinch up with Oliveira and turn him up against the fence. If there's anybody that can catch Islam Makhachev and knock him out, it would come from Charles Oliveira. Because of the amount of pressure, aggression, precision, power, and technique that he possesses with his offense, there is no one like him in the weight class. So I ultimately do think the level of danger from Charles Oliveira is a 5 out of 10. Here's where it kind of falls off a cliff. So the number 1 runner-up, I believe, is Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler has actually the best style to beat Islam. He has potentially more power than anybody else. It's a bit of an argument with him and Oliveira and maybe Gaethje. He's on paper one of the more skilled wrestlers. He has very good takedown defense that could stop Islam's takedowns better than anybody else. So in fact, his level of danger should be above Oliveira's because he can outstrike Islam, overpower him, and stuff all the takedowns. But the reason why he's under Oliveira is because he has one of the lowest fight IQ out of any elite fighter in the UFC. So knowing him, he's going to gas himself out trying to knock Islam out, who is very defensive minded. Islam's going to take him down very early and submit him. The number 2 runner-up is another familiar opponent for Islam, Arman Tsarukyan. Arman's also one of the better wrestlers who before showed to be competitive in that area with Islam. Even though Islam did get the better of him overall, he has a lot of power, very good kick dexterity, and should not get beat as easily as some of the other fighters. The number 3 runner-up, I believe, is Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier has threatening boxing skill, a great guillotine to challenge any wrestler, and a great amount of experience as well. If anybody's asking about Justin Gaethje, Gaethje just does not have the grappling skill to have any success with Islam. And then we go to the welterweight division with the only English champion right now, looking to defend his belt for the 2nd time, Leon Edwards. Leon Edwards is one of the more skilled strikers in the UFC, while also being very well-rounded himself. He has great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu shown in his Nate Diaz fight. He has pretty good wrestling skill offensively, being the only fighter to take down Kamaru Usman, even though Colby, arguably did too. But he didn't do it like Leon. Leon took Usman down, held him down, and got his back. That is extremely impressive, and beat Usman twice in their trilogy. But who is his nightmare matchup? I believe it's Colby Covington. Colby Covington, stylistically, should be a much more difficult matchup than Kamaru Usman was. A lot of people bring parallels between Colby and Usman, but Colby's different. Colby has a lot more relentless pressure, a lot more activity, throws strikes all over the place, whereas Usman's more of a sniper from distance and then gets in the clinch with you and then throws a lot of punches at you. Colby has output at all times up until he gets you on the ground. He's not much of a ground and pound guy, but he is one of the best fighters in the welterweight division at getting and holding positions, showing his impeccable wrestling skill. He's also extremely tough, very durable. Even if he gets dropped, he's able to get back quickly, and I think a lot of that has to do with his insane gas tank. There is very few fighters in UFC history that have the gas tank of Colby Covington. And we do know that Leon Edwards has been taken down very often, even against Kamaru Usman in both fights. Colby doesn't have the same kind of injuries that Usman had. He is much better to shoot than Usman does. Usman these days kind of just bends down and reaches at your legs. Colby's a lot more multifaceted when it comes to his takedowns, and he's way more explosive with them too. And we do know that Leon likes to give up his back. He's very good at hand fighting with you, very good at wrist control, but Colby is way better than Kamaru Usman at getting the back. Usman does not play that game at all, even if it presents itself. Colby will, as we've seen him do it in the past. He is extremely fast at getting those kind of positions. So I think the level of danger from Colby Covington is a 6 out of 10. The number 1 runner-up, in my opinion, is Shavkat Rakhmonov. Shavkat is such a lethal, well-rounded fighter. Insane precision in his strikes, very lethal submission game, has finished every one of his opponents. He's also roughly the same size, if not bigger than Leon, while having the youth on his side. He has a wrestling game that can threaten Leon in that area, switch it up with good strikes, great distance management, has a longer reach with that striking proficiency. Shavkat is quite a difficult style for Leon Edwards. The number 2 runner-up, I believe, is still Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman still has the pressure. He still has somewhat of a physical wrestling game these days. He has a lot of power in his hands, a great amount of experience, and he knows Leon better than anybody else, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, you know, kind of like the Volkan-Max relationship. I believe all of this makes Usman more competitive than some of the other fighters in this weight class. And then the third runner-up, I believe, is Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns can also take the fight to the ground, and he is better than anybody else on paper to get Leon's back if he gives it up. He also has a lot of power, but he should absolutely get outstruck. And then we go to the shallowest male division in the UFC, the middleweight division, who has a 2-time champion, one of the greatest middleweights of all time, Israel Adesanya. Adesanya is one of the best strikers in the UFC. He's working on his takedown defense a lot more. He's an incredibly intelligent fighter. Can be a bit boring to watch sometimes, but he is intelligent with his approach to get the victory. At the end of the day, Adesanya is a winner, but because of his style being so much of a specialist, he does have solid takedown defense up against the fence, but hasn't displayed it up against any amazing wrestler yet. The best was Derek Brunson, and maybe Robert Whittaker, who in any other division like the welterweights, for an example, compare their skill to welterweights. They don't compare it to someone like Colby, for an example. But there is a fighter who went up to middleweight, and he is very, very different. As my nightmare matchup, Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat Chimaev is easily, in the top 15, the best wrestler. Not only that, he is quick to get your back, he is quick to submit you, he is insane ground and pound, he is so physically strong. Even for the middleweight division, I think that strength is going to hold up. And now being a middleweight, he's going to be much faster than most of these guys. So he has the kind of power to one-shot you. He also has a speed advantage against most of his opponents, while having the best wrestling game in the weight class. It honestly is looking like Khamzat should be a dominant force. And we know Adesanya does not have good takedown defense in the center of the octagon and is decent up against the fence. In the center of the cage, Khamzat takes him down very easily. Against the fence, even as good as Adesanya is there compared to the center, I think it's nowhere near ready to stop Khamzat. The only thing that goes against Khamzat here is, number 1, a questionable gas tank. But then again, Adesanya doesn't have high output, so he's not going to impose some kind of pressure on Khamzat to expend his gas tank. It's going to be up to Khamzat, who's going to be controlling the pace of the fight, whether he wants to go fast or he wants to go slow. And number 2, Khamzat doesn't move his head too much. So going up against one of the best snipers in the UFC, if anybody can catch Khamzat, it is someone like Adesanya. And maybe there is a trend with what Sean O'Malley showed against his grappling opponent, and Adesanya could deliver something similar to someone like Khamzat, maybe. But I ultimately do think the level of danger from Khamzat Chimaev is an 8 out of 10. The number 1 runner-up that can change, I believe, is Robert Whittaker. Even though he just lost to Dricus du Plessis, I think stylistically, Whittaker is so well-rounded with a good enough wrestling game to give Adesanya issues. As shown in their second fight, he took down Adesanya multiple times, and he's more of a striker than he is a wrestler. Even in the striking, he can make the fight competitive, right? I think he will lose the striking exchanges, but he will make it competitive in the stand-up. Mix up his wrestling is always going to give Adesanya a bit of an issue. The number 2 runner-up, I believe, is Dricus du Plessis, who's on the same level as Whittaker. The reason why I don't put him higher than Whittaker is for the fact that sometimes he gets a little too wild, and against a guy who counters as well as Adesanya does, he is more likely to get knocked out by Adesanya. But Dricus is so physically strong. He is well-rounded. He has a wrestling game. Up against Adesanya, besides maybe Khamzat, he has the most likelihood of submitting Adesanya. Maybe even more than Khamzat, maybe, because he has insanely good submissions. He also has a lot of power in his hands. He is extremely awkward. Dricus can be a bit of an issue for Adesanya. And then the number 3 runner-up, I believe, is Bo Nickel. After Khamzat, I believe Bo Nickel has the best wrestling in the weight class right now. I think he needs a little bit more experience to make a complete transition MMA with his wrestling, because he still kind of wrestles like a wrestler. And still, even with that, he is one of the best wrestlers at middleweight. And he only just started. He has a threatening Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game. Because of how fast he gets positions on you, he does have submissions. He has a lot of power in his hands. Very explosive, transitions that wrestling explosion into his own strikes. Bo Nickel being the 4th most dangerous fight for Adesanya not only speaks to how special this guy is, but also speaks to how shallow this weight class is. We're gonna skip the light heavyweight division because there is no champion, so we finally go to the big boys, the heavyweight division, whose champion is arguably the best fighter of all time. I'm not going to say greatest, as I can't because of the PEDs, but arguably the best fighter of all time is their champion, Jon Jones, who has all the records at light heavyweight, who now rules another weight class. I mean, what is there to say about Jon Jones that isn't known? As well-rounded as you can be for a heavier guy. Insane submissions, probably the highest fight IQ out of any fighter I've ever seen, a 7-foot reach, very good kicking dexterity, and one of the more creative fighters we have seen. There is no one like Jon Jones. But if there is going to be a nightmare matchup, it's a toss-up between 2 fighters, as I have them equal when it comes to danger level. So the nightmare matchup, in my opinion, is Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall has incredibly fast boxing. His hand speed is insane to watch for a heavyweight. It reminds me of Fedor, right? You don't see guys throw as fast with their hands like he does. And he's enormous too. He's 6'5", an inch taller than Jones, and weighs like almost 260. He has a wrestling game with one of the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the weight class right now. So if there's anybody that can stuff takedowns, even if Jones takes him to the ground, can fight off the submissions, get it to the feet, and uses boxing against Jones, it would be Tom Aspinall. Because when it comes to striking, Jones' weakest area is his boxing. Aspinall's strength in the stand-up is his boxing. And like I've been talking about for a long time, ever since Aspinall bursted onto the scene, I always said that Aspinall holding his chin up in the air is his biggest weakness. But the thing is, Jones is not known for his power. His boxing is his weakest part of his game. Up against Jones, getting clipped on the chin may be less likely to happen than some of the other guys like a Pavlovich, like a Miocic. If he's boxing with somebody, he's less likely to get clipped by Jones than somebody else. So his weakness is not as much of a weakness going up against Jones. That is why I'm ultimately going to pick Tom Aspinall as the nightmare matchup, and I believe he's a 4 out of 10. The number 1 runner-up, who I'll say is also a 4, is Sergey Pavlovich. Sergey is like top 2 most powerful fighters. He has the same reach as Jones, 84 inches. So if Jones is punching at him, he can also return with his own at the same distance. He's physically strong, he's fast, and he has an impeccable chin. If anybody can knock Jones out, it's going to be from Sergey. The number 2 runner-up, I believe, is Curtis Blaydes. One big reason for it, he can stuff the takedowns better than anybody else. Jones is a better striker overall. If the fight gets to the ground somewhat or in the clinch, Jones can beat him up in there or submit him. But Blaydes has good wrestling. He's very, very big. The 3rd runner-up, I believe, is Stipe Miocic. Even though Stipe is old now, he still has one of the best boxing in the whole division. He has a wrestling base, and he has a lot of experience. The only reason I put him below Blaydes is for the fact that he's very inactive, and he is old. He is really old, coming off a knockout loss. So those are all the nightmare matchups for every UFC champion. And as you can see, Adesanya, in my opinion, has the biggest nightmare matchup. The smallest nightmare matchup is for Jones. I mean, it's heavyweight, what can you expect? And all the others are around a moderate level, which goes to show you that all of the champions right now have a very interesting future for the fans to watch. So hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure to give this a thumbs up if you enjoy my content, make sure to give this a like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to hit the bell for notifications, and I'll see you guys in the next video.